Now then, as promised, somebody who knows Donald Trump well and fought alongside him in many political battles. Victoria Coates was his Deputy National Security Advisor in the first Trump administration, and she is Vice President of the Conservative Heritage Foundation in Washington. Welcome to the show, Victoria. Great to have you with us again. Can I start by asking whether you think, quite seriously, Donald Trump intends or would be prepared to invade Greenland?
Well, Andrew, good to see you. Happy 2026.
And to you.
Thank you. Now, I think the Greenland issue is a strategic one for President Trump. I think it is an issue along with Panama, specifically in the Western Hemisphere, that has really captured his attention given the vulnerability to the Arctic. And I don't think this is a situation that would require military intervention. I've seen some interesting movement today. For example, the Prime Minister of Denmark's office put out a fairly measured statement in conjunction with Italy, France, Finland, some other NATO allies, saying that this is something that needs to be done in discussion with the United States, decided by Denmark and Greenland. I think that's pretty reasonable. We've been talking about the freedom of association agreements we have with the islands in the Pacific, which are very beneficial to both parties, and that could take a burden off of Greenland. So I think there's a lot of possibilities there. I think what you're hearing from the president is his urgency on the issue.
So you could see a situation where, in a sense, there was a deal done, where the American military, perhaps American mineral companies, went into Greenland in a way they're not there at the moment. But do you think that could be done without Greenland actually, quotes, becoming part of the United States, quotes?
Oh, yes. And that's what these FAA agreements provide for us with Micronesia, for example, the Marshall Islands, is they actually have a degree of political participation in the U.S. system. They get a lot of assistance from the United States. And in return, we have things like we have military oversight. So say a Chinese warship can't dock there unless we say it's OK, and we generally don't. So that kind of exchange could be both really good for Greenland security, get the Russians and the Chinese out, but then also provide for the citizens of Greenland.
So you think, in essence, influence, an important grip on Greenland, but without American sovereignty, might be enough for the administration?
There are degrees of this, yes. So I think that is the kind of agreement that should be pursued. And if certainly President Trump has demonstrated anything over the last 75 years, it's that he prefers to make deals than to make war.
And if it was the case that a deal could be struck with the European members of NATO over Greenland, do you think that would help him be more positive about helping Ukraine, which is obviously the thing that concerns European nations more than any other?
Well, and I think that's actually a really key point. If the United States is doing more for Greenland, and it's very much in our sphere, then Denmark can do more for Ukraine and won't have that burden on their resources. And so I very much see this as part of the transatlantic security arrangement, where Europe is doing more in Europe. And I think you're also hearing from the administration they aren't as interested in European intervention in the Pacific as we were in the first Trump term. Like, that's something we're going to have to deal with Australia and Japan, et cetera. We need Europe to be focused on Europe and take that primary burden for Ukraine.
So in a sense, we're back to spheres of influence, which might have been something earlier in the 20th century, rather than the kind of international order post-1945, the United Nations and all the rest of it.
This is definitely a different world order. I agree with that. And where we were 80 years ago is not where we are now. I mean, none of the institutions that were built up after the war had a China focus, for example, and China's now much more important to us than the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. So that is a different world. And the United States has to look at all quadrants. Because we have a new focus on the Western Hemisphere doesn't mean we don't care about Europe, that we wouldn't continue to provide leadership, nuclear umbrella, troops on the ground, all of those things. But we need Europe to also be doing more there because of Western Hem, because of Indo-Pacific, because of the Middle East.
Just cutting to the chase, if I may, is the proposal that you believe is the real one, that if Europe if Western European NATO members don't allow America to do what it wants to do in Greenland, then NATO is indeed under threat. Now, you know perfectly well that that is the most terrifying thing for Western Europe. They rely on NATO completely, and therefore, is it a fairly brutal bargain in the end? If you want NATO, you let us do what we want in Greenland.
Well, and I don't know that I would call it a brutal bargain. What I would say is what happened in The Hague in April, the pledges made by the major economies of Europe to get to 5% of defense spending, that's what saves Europe, ultimately. We want a strong Europe. We want a Europe taking a lead on Europe's defenses for all the reasons that we've been discussing. And, if that, in the end, that is what happens and we are able to incorporate a strategic asset in Greenland, I think that's a win-win.
Let me ask you about another part of the world for obvious reasons. After what happened to Maduro, clearly there have been menacing noises made by the administration about, for instance, Colombia and to a lesser extent Mexico. Do you think that this is part of a wider turn of policy against some of the regimes that President Trump regards as unfriendly, drug-running narco-terrorists and the rest of it across South America?
I think you really put your finger on it. His focus is on the security of the American people, and the narco-terrorists, the people who are trafficking both drugs and human beings into our country, are the primary national security interests that we have here. And they have tried for a year to persuade Maduro. Venezuela is the key bad actor here, to persuade him to take a different path. He's been offered deals of various sorts. He refused, and ultimately this was the decision that was made. Colombia is a different case. There are going to be elections in Colombia in May. Petro can't run for another term. So there will be change in Colombia in the first 6 months of this year. We don't necessarily have to implement that change. And the other thing is we have much older historic military to military relationships with Colombia, which do endure. Mexico, final problem, is even more difficult for us because it is on our border. So that is the most immediate threat. The cartels there are a huge problem. The president is trying to work with President Sheinbaum. I mean, I was surprised by the strength of their relationship. So they are making an effort. I just wish she would ask for more U.S. support against the cartels.
Well, Victoria, I thought this was going to be an interesting conversation, and so it has proved. Thank you so much for that.